Om Angushtamatra Purushontaraatma Sada Jananam Hridaye Sannivishtaha Tam Svat Sharirat Pravrihin Munjadiveshikam Dhairyena Tam Vidyat Chukram Amritam Tam Vidyat Chukram Amritamiti Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, the Purusha, the inner soul, who is no larger than a thumb, resides always in the heart of everyone. One should separate him with patience from one's own body, just as one separates a blade of grass from its main fiber. Know that soul to be pure, bright, and immortal. Know that soul to be pure, bright, and immortal. Om, peace, peace, peace. Katha Upanishad 2.3.17. Good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be here again after a few months. I love San Diego. And it's a nice break from the chaos of Hollywood. In my opinion, one of the best things about our order, our tradition, is its broadness and its liberality. It's very unique in that way, I'd say. There are other liberal traditions, but I find this one to be especially liberal. It's one of the things that attracted me to this tradition and inspired me to join the Ramakrishna order in the first place. But that liberality also could have some drawbacks. Often devotees tell me that when they attend talks at our different Vedanta societies, especially in the West, in different Western centers, they'll get different teachings from different swamis. And it's wonderful that different swamis can have their own unique take, a different slant. They can teach Ramakrishna and Vivekananda and Holy Mother in their own way, but it can also be confusing. And some devotees have told me that, they watch one Swami's talks and it's all about Jnana and all about Advaita. Another Swami's talks all about Bhakti. Forget about Jnana. Another one is all about Karma Yoga. And the way I'd put it, after hearing a number of devotees saying this, even some monastics, in the context of our monastic order, the confusion stems to a certain extent from the fact that we have a 2-year training center in Belumat where we're taught the scriptures, and we're taught the scriptures using Shankara's commentaries. So obviously we're taught then the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra from the standpoint of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. At the same time, many people come to the order and feel drawn to the order through devotion to Sri Ramakrishna, or Swami Vivekananda, or Holy Mother, or all of the above. And even monks then feel this kind of conflict sometimes about how to reconcile Jnana with Bhakti, Advaita Vedanta with devotion, and Karma Yoga, and so on. These are very deep, I think, issues. And yeah, it's a kind of, I would call it a kind of whiplash sometimes. People sometimes feel whiplash. Because you read certain texts or you talk to certain swamis and you get Jnana. Another swami, you get Karma Yoga. Another one, you get Bhakti Yoga, and you don't know where to stand. And sometimes they really feel like there's a conflict, that it would be nice if you can bring everything together, but it's easier said than done. So what I want to talk about today is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, but from a very different standpoint than the one that maybe many people are used to. When we hear Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, we almost immediately assume that it's based on Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. It is by far the most popular and well-known version of the path of knowledge, but it's not the only one. It's a really important point to keep in mind. It's not the only one, and in fact, Vedanta itself is vast, and Advaita Vedanta is only one among many schools of Vedanta. And most of the other schools of Vedanta, other than Shankara's, are devotional schools. Not all, but most of them. Ramanuja school of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, Madhva school, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is based on Achinta Bheda Veda Vedanta. They're all bhakti schools, devotional schools of Vedanta. And interestingly, many of them give a prominent place to the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. This is something that's not well known. Because most people, when they hear Vedanta, they equate it with Advaita Vedanta, and they think the path of knowledge equals Advaita Vedanta. But that's a serious mistake. So I want to talk today about how even devotees, bhaktas, can, not only can, but should practice the path of knowledge. So hopefully this will be new to you, because I don't, at least from what I've seen from talking to people, most people don't even know about devotional forms of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. So I want to answer a number of questions. So first of all, what exactly is the path of knowledge in devotional traditions? How is this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga different from the path of knowledge taught by Shankara and his followers, based on classical Advaita Vedanta? What are the benefits, the spiritual benefits of practicing bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga? Why is it important at all for bhaktas to practice Jnana Yoga in this sense? And how do we combine a bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga with the other yogas, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga? And I also want to make a broader overarching argument, which is going to be very controversial. The argument is as follows. For the vast majority of spiritual aspirants, I think it's safer, more practical, and more beneficial to practice the kind of bhakti-oriented path of knowledge that I'll be talking about today, rather than the classical Advaitic form of Jnana Yoga. Okay, and I'll explain why, based on the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna mainly. All right, so here's the structure of the talk. First of all, just so we're all on the same page, I'll talk briefly about how Shankara understands the path of knowledge in his philosophy of classical Advaita Vedanta. Second, how does Ramanuja explain the path of knowledge in his devotional school of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta? Thirdly, how does Sri Ramakrishna understand bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, path of knowledge? And how does Sri Ramakrishna recommend that we combine this bhakti-oriented path of knowledge with the other yogas, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, Karma Yoga? And I want to conclude the talk with some practical suggestions on how we can incorporate bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga into our daily spiritual practice. So it's a lot, and we might even end with a little guided meditation on how we can do bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, maybe 5 minutes if we have some time, but let's play it by ear. So first, what is Jnana Yoga in Shankara school of Advaita Vedanta? Simple. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. We listen to Advaitic teachings from a qualified guru, especially the Mahavakyas. Tattvam Asi, for instance, is one of the Mahavakyas. You are non-dual pure consciousness. Aham Brahmasmi is another one. I am that non-dual pure consciousness. So on. You listen to it. Shravana. Manana, you reflect on that teaching from all sides, trying to remove doubts about that teaching. Third, Nididhyasana. You meditate deeply on that teaching, and you try to internalize that teaching in your day-to-day life. That's it. That's the path of knowledge. Sounds easy, but actually it's extraordinarily difficult. The problem is it's easy to engage in it, to do it. Anybody can, with ears, can hear the Mahavakyas, can tell themselves they're non-dual pure consciousness, can even intellectually reflect on it. But practicing is something very different. That's the sticking point for most people. That's why Shankara himself insisted on eligibility requirements, very, very strict and high eligibility requirements to even get off the ground with the practice of classical Advaitic Jnana Yoga. He said you have to be perfectly equipped. You have to attain mastery in the sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana. And I won't go into the details, but very high spiritual prerequisites. And there are two more key features that I wanted to highlight in this classical Advaitic path of knowledge. Number one, in this path, you have to take this entire world to be an illusory appearance, mithya. And even the personal God is part of that dream. It's also an illusory appearance. So you engage in bhakti so long as you inhabit the standpoint of ignorance, so long as you feel a difference between you and the personal God, so long as you see this world of names and forms. But that from the ultimate standpoint, the personal God turns out not to exist. All the different names and forms here, the different chairs, the people here, false, don't exist. The fact that I'm talking to you now, not true. All that. The other thing that Shankara emphasizes is that Jnana Yoga cannot and should not be practiced alongside other yogas. Okay, he says that Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is meant for superior spiritual aspirants, uttama adhikaris, who have extremely pure minds and who have attained mastery in sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana. For everyone else, they should not practice Jnana Yoga. They should practice instead Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, which he considers to be preparatory disciplines that help us to purify our minds, thereby eventually, after the course of many lifetimes, presumably, making us eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. And once we become eligible, we stop practicing Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga, and we practice the path of knowledge alone. Once we get the undergraduate degree, we move on to the master's and then the PhD, but we don't practice the PhD and the bachelor's at the same time. One, then the other. This is Shankara's view. So keep all that in mind. That's just background. Because it's helpful to understand a new way of thinking about Jnana Yoga by having a common reference point, right? Now, second, what is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, in Ramanuja's philosophy of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta? Ramanuja was a great bhakta, and he worshipped God, especially in the form of Vishnu Narayana. He considered Vishnu Narayana to be the ultimate reality. And one thing that many people don't know about Ramanuja is that he did not even accept the reality of non-dual pure consciousness. He did not accept Nirguna Brahman at all, the reality of attributeless pure consciousness. Okay. And yet, he places great importance on the path of knowledge. How is this possible? He doesn't accept Shankara's Brahman, non-dual Brahman, and yet, again and again, he emphasizes the path of knowledge. It's because he explains the practice of the path of knowledge very differently from Shankara. There are similarities, but there are important differences also. Here's what Ramanuja says. He actually flips the tables on Shankara. Shankara says, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, is a preparatory discipline that makes you eligible to practice the higher practice of the path of knowledge. Ramanuja says exactly the opposite. Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is a preparatory discipline to make you eligible to practice the higher practice of the path of devotion, Bhakti Yoga. So why? What's the logic of it, and what does he mean by Jnana Yoga? Jnana Yoga, according to Ramanuja, is meditating on your true nature as an individual soul, a jivatma, separate from the body-mind complex in your heart. That's it. That's Jnana Yoga according to Ramanuja. And you might ask, well, why is this necessary for practicing Bhakti Yoga? Ramanuja says, so long as we identify with this physical body, so long even as we identify with the mind, we can never feel true bhakti for God. It's the soul that feels an innate devotion and love for God. And our problem, our ignorance, is that we mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex. And so long as we do, we won't feel true bhakti. We'll try to feel bhakti. That's called Vaidhi bhakti. We'll do japa, we'll go to arati, we'll come to these talks, but that innate, spontaneous, natural devotion won't come until we break our identification with the body-mind complex. And until we feel, really feel, have a direct spiritual experience of ourselves as souls separate from the body-mind complex. Because as souls, we are children of the divine, we are sparks of the divine fire, we are amshas of the divine, we're a portion of the divine. Bhagavan Krishna says, Mameva amsho jiva loke jiva bhuta sanatanaha. Every jiva Every soul is a portion of me, says Krishna, is a portion of the divine, a spark of that divine fire. In his work, Vedanta Sangraha, Ramanuja says in paragraph 245, there's a beautiful, very spiritually profound statement that he makes. He says, Atmabhimano yadrishaha tad anuguna eva purushartha pratitihi. One's values and aims in life are determined by how one thinks of oneself. I'll say that again. One's values and aims in life are determined by how one thinks of oneself. What does that mean? What does he mean by that? If we think of ourselves as bodies, we'll look at everybody else as bodies. And what will we value? Things that gratify the body. If I identify with the mind, I'll look at other people as minds. And what will I value? The things of the mind, the life of the mind, the pleasures of the mind. And if I identify with the soul, I'll start to look at everybody, not as bodies, not as minds, but as souls. Using the body, using the mind as instruments, as vehicles. Many of you came by car. Nobody says, I am the car. Say, I use the car to get here. The car is my instrument. The car is my vehicle. Exactly like that. Our whole outlook changes toward ourselves, toward this world, toward other people. We look at people as souls using the body-mind complex. As a chariot, that's the famous metaphor used in the Kathopanishad, right? We'll get to that later as well. So that's an extremely important insight, I think, a spiritual insight that Ramanuja makes. The moment we start to identify as a soul, our whole outlook on life gets revolutionized. And we look at this entire world as spiritual. We look at everybody as divine beings, as sparks of that divine fire struggling to manifest that divinity within. And we're all in the same boat. And then we have this kind of empathy for people rather than seeing this world as a kind of competition between us and them. Okay, so now you might be thinking, well, now Medhananda is coming out and saying he's a follower of Ramanuja rather than Shankara. That would be a mistake. And I want to explain why. I think that there's a great deal to learn from Ramanuja's philosophy. That's what I want to emphasize. I think people, when they talk about Vedanta, most people think about Shankara and they neglect the non-Shankarite schools of Vedanta. And I think it's a great shame because there's something to learn from all of the great Vedantic traditions, all of the great spiritual traditions of the world, in fact. So let's always be receptive and open to what different spiritual traditions have to offer. And I think what Ramanuja, especially his understanding of Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, is extremely powerful and practical for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants. And let me explain one more thing before I move away from Ramanuja. Why is Jnana Yoga? No, I've already explained why Jnana Yoga is a prerequisite for the practice of Bhakti Yoga. But what exactly is Bhakti Yoga for Ramanuja? That's another important question. He means something very specific and high level by Bhakti Yoga. What he means is constantly contemplating God alone, constantly thinking of God. You might think, how is that high level? It's easy, I can do it. Try it for 30 seconds. I can almost guarantee you, within 5 seconds, your mind will be going here and there. It's the hardest thing in the world to think constantly of God. But that's what Bhakti Yoga is, according to Ramanuja. That's why he says a prerequisite for the strict practice of Bhakti Yoga, thinking constantly of God, is realization of your true spiritual nature as an eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. Only then will we naturally and spontaneously think of God at all times. That's the idea, okay? So now, let's come to Sri Ramakrishna. What exactly is the path of knowledge in Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? In my scholarly work, I characterize Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy as Vijnana Vedanta, because I think it's a beautifully harmonizing Vedantic philosophy that accepts the spiritual core of all of the different traditional schools of Vedanta, Shankara school, Ramanuja school, Madhva school, Chaitanya school, and so on and so forth, in a very, very broad way. And his philosophy, I argue, is based on a really unique and expansive spiritual experience, which he calls Vijnana. He says the Vijnani realizes that the ultimate reality, the divine reality, is not just impersonal, attributeless, non-dual pure consciousness, like Shankara claims, but is equally saguna, the personal God, Shakti. And the Vijnani, instead of looking upon this world as a dream, as an illusory appearance, a la Shankara, The Vijnani looks upon this world as a mansion of mirth, Mojar Kuti. Because the Vijnani sees everything in the world as a blissful manifestation of the divine, as a blissful manifestation of Divine Mother herself. Okay, so with that in the background, Sri Ramakrishna, if you study the gospel carefully, what you'll find is he gives a lot of teachings about the nature of ultimate reality. And if we, again, just as a contrast, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, there's a famous Sanskrit formula to capture his philosophy in a nutshell. What is it? Brahma Satyam, Jagat, Mithya, and then Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. Non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. Jagat is Mithya. This world of names and forms is an illusion. And Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. The individual soul is none other than non-dual pure consciousness. That's it. That's all of classical Advaita. And then, now that I'm trying to establish Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, we need a nice, catchy Sanskrit formula for that as well. So what would it be? I came up with this. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shakti Satyam. That's the first difference between Shankara's philosophy and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. According to Shankara, Brahma Satyam, only non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness is real. Sri Ramakrishna says Brahma Shakti Satyam. The ultimate reality is Brahma and Shakti. Brahman and Shakti at the same time. So I do this kind of hyphenated Brahman, Brahma hyphen Shakti. It's a phrase that I borrow from M, by the way, Mahananda Gupta. He uses this phrase in his Srimad Darshan, which is not in the gospel. It's a different multi-volume work, which is a recording of his dialogues with visitors. And he would refer to Sri Ramakrishna's conception of the ultimate reality as Brahma Shakti. So, Brahma Shakti Satyam, this first part of the Sanskrit formula of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta points out the key difference between Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy and the philosophies of Shankara and Ramanuja. How? Because Shankara's philosophy accepts the ultimate reality only of impersonal, attributeless, non-dual pure consciousness. Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts that, but tells Shankara, drop the only. The ultimate reality is not only Nirguna, it's also Saguna. And then he turns to Ramanuja and he says, I fully agree with you, Ramanuja, that God, that ultimate reality is Vishnu Narayana. But don't say that ultimate reality is only Vishnu Narayana and that it cannot be Nirguna. It cannot be impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. It's equally non-dual, pure consciousness. So that's Sri Ramakrishna's view. See how it's broader? He accepts the spiritual core of Shankara's philosophy and Ramanuja's philosophy and Madhva's philosophy, but says never place a limit to God. Bhagavana kono iti ne. Should never say that God can only be this and nothing more. Right? So from Sri Ramakrishna's very broad standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, these traditional schools of Vedanta are great, but at the same time a little bit one-sided. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is expansive and many-sided, all-embracing. And another important difference between traditional schools of Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta has to do with how they understand the scheme of spiritual practices. Because as we've already seen, in Shankara's school and in Ramanuja's school, there are hierarchies of yogas. There's a hierarchical relationship, which means what? According to Shankara, there's one highest yoga, the path of knowledge. According to Ramanuja and other bhakti schools, there is also only one highest path, but that's not the path of knowledge, the path of bhakti. Bhakti Yoga. And they've been debating and warring for centuries about this, fighting with each other. And Sri Ramakrishna comes along and says, stop all this bickering and fighting. Any of these yogas are perfectly capable of taking us to the highest goal, and there's no higher and lower. There's just a matter of what's best for you, based on your samskaras, your past life tendencies, based on what you did in previous lives, which path is best for you. But to say that one is objectively better than the others, you're barking up the wrong tree. This is Sri Ramakrishna's approach. At the same time, he says, and he'll say this emphatically again and again in the gospel, he'll say, in this age, for most spiritual aspirants, bhakti yoga is the best path. Okay? And you might say, how is this not a hierarchy? Well, let me first of all give a quotation and then we can talk about that. He says, in the Kali Yuga, the life of human beings is centered on food. People cannot get rid of the feeling that they are the body and the ego. Therefore, the path of devotion is prescribed for this cycle. This is an easy path. You will attain God if you sing her name and glories and pray to her with a longing heart. There is not the least doubt about it. So why is he saying that bhakti yoga is the best for most people? It's because most of us have tremendous body consciousness. No matter how much we can talk big about how we're the Atman and all that, it's extremely difficult in practice to really feel that we're divine souls separate from the body-mind complexes. And as a result, the safest and best practice is bhakti yoga. Even though any of the other paths, including Jnana Yoga, Shankara's Jnana Yoga, Raja Yoga, Patanjali, and all these things, they're also direct paths. If you can meet the eligibility requirements, if you're really eligible to practice those things, and he's saying that most people aren't, even if many people delude themselves into thinking that they are, okay? And in fact, in the gospel, we find him warning against the practice of classical Advaitic Jnana Yoga again and again. And I'm going to read to you one of the strongest messages or cautionary warnings against the practice of Jnana Yoga that you find in the gospel. He says, one may reach God by following the path of discrimination too. That is called Jnana Yoga, but it is an extremely difficult path. The feeling I am Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, is not good. A person who thinks this way while still having body consciousness does great harm to herself. She cannot make any progress in spiritual life. In fact, she's dragged down into worldliness and bondage. She deceives herself as well as others. She cannot even understand her own plight. So the danger here is that he knew, Sri Ramakrishna was acutely aware of the danger of the path of knowledge. First of all, that there's something really glamorous and appealing about it. And especially intellectually appealing, especially in a skeptical age, in a post-enlightenment age where people are Darwin, Freud, Marx, and all these people are Nietzsche, God is dead. So yeah, we don't have to believe in God, but we can still be spiritual, and all we have to do is tell ourselves that we're the Atman. It's very easy. Swami says, no, not so easy. It's the hardest thing in the world. But it's very easy to talk about it and become a YouTube guru overnight and get lots of followers, telling others that they're the Atman. But if you are not eligible to practice this path of knowledge, you end up deceiving yourself and deceiving others. You might ask, this is actually, I gave a version of this talk in Hollywood a few weeks ago. And after the talk, I asked Mahayogananda what he thought about it. And he said something really interesting. He said, he liked it, but that on the classical Advaitic side, I gave the Sanskrit formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jiva Brahma Vinaparaha. That last line, the second line, that the individual soul is none other than non-dual pure consciousness. He said, in your Sanskrit formula for Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, it's just Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. But what about the next line? What's the relationship between the individual soul and the ultimate reality? I thought that was a great question, so I want to address that briefly. It just becomes cumbersome because the Sanskrit gets very long. But here's the way I see it. What exactly is the relationship between the jiva, the individual soul, and the divine? According to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, he says it, fortunately, very clearly. One day, this is recorded in the Gospel, when he finds that all the people in the room are part of his own inner circle, the antaranga. He says, since you are all my very own, I will tell you, I have come to the final realization that I am a servant and God is a master, that I am a portion, a spark of the divine, and God is the whole, and that sometimes I think to myself, I am identical with non-dual pure consciousness. I am God. All three of those relationships equally true in different states of consciousness. And he would often quote something that's attributed to Hanuman, the great Bhakta of Rama. And this is a famous Sanskrit verse. So this would be the Sanskrit to cap the Vijnana Vedanta formula. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam, and then we have to add Deha Buddhya Dasosmi, Jiva Buddhya Twadamshakaha, Atma Buddhya Tvamevaham Iti Me Nishchitamatihi. Hanuman tells Rama, when I identify with the body, the physical body, I say I'm your servant. When I identify with the Jivatma, which is the culmination of the practice of Jnana Yoga, bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, then I say I am a portion of you, a spark of the divine. And when I identify with non-dual pure consciousness, I say, O Rama, that I am you, you are me. Sri Ramakrishna affirms the truth of all of these different relationships with God at different levels of consciousness, without any hierarchy saying one is more true than the other. They're all true in different states of consciousness. Okay, so that's Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Now, let's go a little bit deeper. When Sri Ramakrishna says that for this age, Bhakti Yoga is the best path, I don't think he's saying that we should all just practice Bhakti Yoga exclusively. What I think he means is, I think the better way to understand what he's suggesting is, we should take Bhakti Yoga, most of us should take Bhakti Yoga as a kind of nucleus, the center of our spiritual practice. And the other yogas can be the kind of protons and electrons hovering around it. They can supplement it, they can complement it, but that at the center, for most people, the best and safest path is Bhakti Yoga. And there's a passage, I'll give the date just because if you want to look it up yourself, you can look at it. It's a very important passage. June 8th, 1883. He talks about the 7 planes that you find in Vedanta, in the Vedas, and the 6 chakras, okay? He says, there's much similarity between the 7 planes described in the Vedanta and the 6 centers of yoga. The first 3 planes of the Vedas may be compared to the first 3 yogic centers, namely Muladhara, Swadhisthana, and Manipura. With ordinary people, the mind dwells in these 3 planes, at the organs of evacuation and generation, and at the navel. When the mind ascends to the 4th plane, the center designated in yoga as Anahata, it sees the Jivatma, the individual soul, as a flame. Besides, it sees light, Jyoti. At this, the aspirant cries, ah, what is this? Ah, what is this? Eki, eki, in Bengali. It's an extraordinary revelation when you realize you're the soul for the first time in your life, in many lifetimes. When the mind rises to the 5th plane, the aspirant wants to hear only about God. This is the Vishuddha center of yoga. The 6th plane and the center known by the yogi as the Adya are one and the same between the eyebrows. When the mind rises there, the aspirant sees God, but still there is a barrier between God and the devotee. It is like the barrier of glass in a lantern, which keeps one from touching the light. King Janaka used to give instruction about Brahmajnana from the 5th plane. After passing the 6 centers, the aspirant arrives at the 7th plane, otherwise known as the 1,000-petal lotus. Reaching it, the mind merges in Brahman. The individual soul and the supreme soul become one. The aspirant goes into samadhi. His consciousness of the body disappears. He loses the knowledge of the outer world. Okay. There's a lot here. It sounds very lofty and high level, but it's very, very practical at the same time. Most people, their consciousness is centered on the 3 lower centers, which means what? They're interested in worldly things. But what happens after, it usually takes many lifetimes. Eventually what you realize is that you'll never find true fulfillment, lasting contentment, true peace of mind by chasing after worldly pleasures, by trying to fulfill worldly pleasures and worldly desires. Why? Because worldly desires can never be fulfilled at the end of the day. In the Bhagavata Purana, there's a famous verse, Na jatu kamaha kamanam upavogena shamyati havisha krishnavatmeva bhuye eva vivardate. Desire is never satisfied through enjoyment. This is a radical statement. You might think that's the only way that you can satisfy desires through enjoyment. No. What happens when you desire something and you finally get what you desire? You fulfill that desire. What happens? You're satisfied briefly, momentarily, but then shortly thereafter, what happens? You crave the same thing, but in a greater quantity, to a greater degree. That's the whole root of addiction to any kind of substance, anything, even social media. You can never get enough. Because as Gita puts it, kama is mahashano. It's insatiable, all devouring. It's never satisfied. That's what you realize. When you start realizing that and you start sort of internalizing that and really putting that into practice in your daily life, you become a spiritual aspirant. And you engage in spiritual practices, realizing that hedonism is not the way to ultimate fulfillment and peace. And Sri Ramakrishna will say that the first meaningful spiritual experience, the first meaningful direct spiritual realization happens at the heart center. When consciousness is elevated from the three lower centers to the heart center. And when we realize that we are individual souls, eternal souls, sparks of the divine fire, separate from the body-mind complex. This is an extraordinary revelation. We shouldn't underestimate it. Many of us want to skip steps and skip straight to God realization or self-realization. That's a very, very high ideal. That is the ultimate ideal. Every one of us will eventually succeed in attaining that ideal. But for us, the most practical goal is to realize ourselves as individual souls, separate from the body-mind complex. That's the proximate goal of all of our spiritual practices. Because it's a prerequisite for the higher realizations and for ultimate liberation. Right? Because Sri Ramakrishna, what does he say? He says, so that realization, when the sadhaka says, my goodness, I am a soul. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I am a soul. But that's not the end. That's not the culmination of spiritual life. Then what? The next step is that that consciousness ascends to the fifth plane, here at the throat level. And then you can't help but think of God at all times. That's Ramanuja's Bhakti Yoga. Sri Ramakrishna just says it very simply. He says, you'll think of nothing but God and talk about nothing but God, and you only want to hear about nothing but God. But that's the same thing as what Ramanuja is talking about when he's talking about Bhakti Yoga. Constantly thinking of God. You can only constantly think of God after you realize yourself as a Jivatman. First, bring your consciousness up to the heart level, realize yourself as an individual soul. Then you come up to the throat center and you think of nothing but God. Naturally, you don't have to struggle to think of God. Spontaneously, the mind will go to God. Sri Ramakrishna goes to a zoo in Kolkata. He's brought to a zoo. The moment he walks in, he sees a lion. What happens? The lion reminds him of the lion vehicle that Durga rides on, Mother Durga. Immediately he goes into samadhi and he says, I couldn't see the rest of the zoo. That's what happens when your mind is at that level. Most people, their minds are constantly going downward. With him, the mind is constantly going upward and he has to forcefully bring his mind down to stay in the worldly plane. But that's what happens at the fifth plane. The mind will naturally just move toward God, toward spiritual things rather than worldly things. But that's also not the culmination of spiritual life. Consciousness eventually ascends to the sixth level, the sixth plane between the eyebrows, and then you have direct realization of the personal God. This is the culmination of Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, and usually most devotional traditions in general. You realize the personal God. And Sri Ramakrishna says, for many people, and you get liberation. It's not that falls short of liberation. You get liberation. And you can dwell in an eternal heaven with your beloved God, whether that's Krishna or Christ or Allah or Vishnu or Ramakrishna. There's a Ramakrishna Loka up there too for us, if we're devotees of Sri Ramakrishna. That's great. But he says some people don't want that. They don't want to eat sugar. They want to become sugar. So for those who want to become sugar, consciousness ascends to the thousand-petal lotus, the seventh plane. And then they realize there's no coming or going, and I am non-different from God. This world doesn't even feel to me to exist anymore, and there's just non-dual pure consciousness. I am that non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? So, but he doesn't say, there's not a hierarchy there. You take your pick, whether you want to eat sugar or become sugar, but it's not mandatory for everyone to go on to the thousand-petal lotus and to merge their identity in non-dual Brahman. Absolutely not. Okay? So now, I want to briefly talk about how Sri Ramakrishna encouraged us to combine the four yogas in our day-to-day spiritual life. Okay, so the first one, Bhakti Yoga. I'm going to talk about it very briefly. What is Bhakti Yoga according to Sri Ramakrishna? Fortunately, his understanding of Bhakti Yoga is not as high level as Ramanuja's, so ordinary people can practice it. And Ramanuja, it's not that he discouraged ordinary Vaidhi Bhakti practices, but he didn't consider them to be Bhakti Yoga proper. He would put them, there's a kind of like a preparatory bhakti. That's what he would qualify it as. He would say that you should do all the preparatory bhakti disciplines. You should go to Arati, you should worship God, you should sing praises of God. Ramanuja himself composed some beautiful hymns to God, devotional hymns. Repeat them and think of God and worship God, do japa, all these things. Okay, and so Sri Ramakrishna, when he defines Bhakti Yoga, he defines it in a very simple way. He says, Nama Guna Kirtana, usually in Bengali, Nam Guna Kirtan, which means sing about God, sing to God, take God's name in whatever way. It could be japa, it could be meditation. Talk about God with other people instead of worldly things. Read devotional scriptures. All of that falls under Namaguna Kirtan. And another thing which people often neglect, but which is on almost every page of the gospel, is prayer. Prayer is a fundamental component in Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion. Pray to God. And try to pray not mechanically, but sincerely, with tears in your eyes, he would say. Tears are a sign of sincerity. It should be heartfelt, that prayer. And another practice within Bhakti Yoga is just, he would say in Bangla, Sarvada Sharan Manan, Sarvada Smarana Manana. Constantly think of God. That is Ramanuja's definition of Bhakti Yoga, right? Sri Ramakrishna says, try it to the best of your ability. And of course, we're going to fail. But we should do it at all times. When you're stuck in a traffic jam, LA, I mean, you're not in LA, thankfully, but I am. I live in Hollywood and stuff. To get, to a place 2 miles away, it might take an hour because of traffic. It's awful. And so a lot of people end up with road rage. Many people have flashed me the bird for no, I still don't know why half the people are just furious with each other on highways, and they're just bitter, angry, road rage. If you're stuck in traffic, better to take God's name. Do japa. Listen to nice bhajans, devotional music, spiritual music. My goodness. Use it as take everything as an opportunity for spiritual practice, rather than grumbling and being frustrated about your situation. All right. What are some of the advantages of Bhakti Yoga? Number one, no prerequisites. Literally anybody can practice Bhakti Yoga. You don't have to attain mastery in the fourfold sadhana to practice bhakti. That doesn't mean that you're going to realize God overnight. It's not that Bhakti Yoga is easy, but anybody can practice it. Anybody can get off the ground with it. And then you try to make progress along those lines. Another advantage, we're all grappling with worldly feelings of different kinds, whether they're lust or anger or greed or this and that, ambition. Sri Ramakrishna says, and this is another natural advantage of Bhakti Yoga. He says, don't deny or repress those feelings, those emotions. Give them a Godward turn. Morfirido. Turn them toward God. Use that energy. It's a kind of energy, right? And you can either use that energy in a worldly direction, you can channelize it in a worldly direction, or you can channelize it toward God, right? And a third advantage of Bhakti Yoga is that you don't have to rely just on your own self-effort. Purushakara is a Sanskrit term. Because God's there. If you ever have struggles or difficulties, pray to God and God will help you. So you're not alone. You're the baby kitten. And the baby kitten just says mew mew. And the mother cat will take it in its mouth and place it wherever it wants. It's the beauty of it. Okay, so that's Bhakti Yoga. We need to combine Bhakti Yoga. Remember, Bhakti Yoga should be the nucleus for most people of their spiritual practice. But you should also practice the path of knowledge, as explained by Sri Ramakrishna. Bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. This is not Shankara's Jnana Yoga, but this something more like Ramanuja's Jnana Yoga. Try to think of yourselves as eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. The Jivatma, which is what we are in our hearts. And by doing that, and by combining that practice of Jnana Yoga with the other yogas, Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga and Raja Yoga, eventually we will attain what Ramanuja calls Atma Avalokanam, the direct spiritual realization of our true nature as Jivatmas separate from the body-mind complex. Eternal souls separate from the body-mind complex. Okay. Sri Ramakrishna would say that most of us identify with the Bodjat Ami. That's the Bengali term for the rascal eye. The eye which is attached to worldly things, especially lust and greed. And he says what we need to do in spiritual life is to identify with our truer spiritual identity as Shantanami or Bhaktirami. The eye of the devotee, the eye of the child of God, the eye of I am a spark of that divine fire. We need to transform our self-understanding, our self-identity. How do we look upon ourselves? Instead of thinking of ourselves as bodies or minds, we should think of ourselves as eternal souls, which are sparks of that divine fire. That's Jnana Yoga. And as I said, both Ramanuja and Sri Ramakrishna say a prerequisite for God realization is self-realization. Lowercase s. Lowercase s self-realization means the Jivatma, realization of oneself as the individual soul separate from the body-mind complex. And he's not alone. And I wanted to mention some beautiful quotations from Christian mystics. Julian of Norwich, in her book, Revelations of Divine Love, she says the following: we can never come to full knowing of God till we know first clearly our own soul. And Meister Eckhart, a great Catholic mystic, says, in the spark soul, the German term is Fünkelein, in the spark soul, which is that, it's a beautiful, very evocative phrase actually. In the spark soul, there is hidden something like the original outbreak of all goodness, something like a brilliant light which incessantly gleams, and something like a burning fire which burns incessantly. This fire is nothing other than the Holy Spirit. So he's giving a very profound mystical interpretation of the third member in the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit. That Holy Trinity is the Jivatma, the eternal soul, which is a spark of the divine fire. And using the same kind of language as Sri Ramakrishna, you see an inner light, as Sri Ramakrishna says, and you see the Jivatma in the shape of a flame, as a spark, right? Now, one objection that I just want to anticipate here, some of you might be asking, well, how different is this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga from Shankara's Advaita Vedantic path of knowledge? Number one, no eligibility requirements. You don't need to be to have attained mastery in the sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana, to get off the ground with Jnana Yoga in the way that you do in the classical Advaitic path. Okay, number one. Number two, in this Jnana Yoga, this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, you're not encouraged to look upon this world as unreal. It's very dangerous, especially for householders, to think about this world as an illusion. Your kids are an illusion, your work is an illusion, then what do? You have no ground to stand on. You'll never feel those conflicts if you practice bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. Because the world is real, everybody is a spark of the divine, right? From the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Third, you don't develop a superiority complex, thinking that you're superior to Bhaktas and look down on them and say that you guys are kind of at a lower level. Eventually you might come up to my level. Some people have. I'm not saying that all followers of Shankara do that, but some, especially the unripe ones, the immature ones, the ones who aren't qualified to practice it, they become egoistic about the path of knowledge. And then they look down on people who follow the path of devotion. You won't feel that. And also, a fourth advantage, you can combine Jnana Yoga with the other yogas to your heart's content in a way that's simply not allowed in the classical Advaitic paradigm. Shankara says that's a big no-no. You're either an inferior spiritual aspirant and you're meant to practice Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga, or you're a superior spiritual aspirant and you stop those practices and you practice Jnana Yoga. But the same human being should not and cannot practice Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga at the same time, and Karma Yoga at the same time. He says it again and again, but that's because he's understanding Jnana Yoga in a certain way and he has a certain kind of metaphysical understanding of the world. But from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, you can and should not just practice bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, but combine it to your heart's content with Bhakti Yoga. Because there's no conflict between believing in yourself as an eternal individual soul, which is a spark of the divine, and worshiping that divine. Coming to Arati, singing devotional songs, listening to music, and doing japa, all those things, you can do both at the same time. And in fact, they help each other, they complement each other. But I want to make a fifth subtle point, which is harder to catch, I think. A fifth difference between the classical Advaitic understanding of Jnana Yoga and this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga that Sri Ramakrishna talks about, that Ramanuja talks about, is this, that in classical Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual self is strictly transcendental. It's completely aloof from this world. It's sakshi. It's just the sakshi, the witness, the eternal witness. And it has nothing to do with this world. In fact, the world is a dream. It doesn't even exist. But this self, this jivatma, in bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, is not just the witness. It has a deep connection with this world and even with the body and the mind. What's that connection? It's explained in Kathopanishad 1.3.3 to 1.3.4. I don't have time to go through the Sanskrit and go into the details, but the basic idea is this. Atmanam ratinam vidhi. The jivatma, the individual soul, is the master of the chariot. And the chariot is the physical body. The horses, it's a horse-driven chariot. The horses are the senses, the sense organs. The reins or the mind. And the charioteer, the one who's holding the reins and thereby guiding the chariot, is the buddhi, the intellect. It's a very beautiful metaphor and it's extremely practical in spiritual life if we think about it deeply. Think of ourselves as that soul inhabiting the body chariot, and think of the body and think of the mind as the instruments of the soul. Just as you came by whatever vehicle you own, whatever car, to come here, we use the body and we use the mind to achieve our soul purposes because we are souls and we're the master of the chariot. Which means what? Instead of dismissing this world as unreal and neglecting the body, no, we say the body is a temple of God because we need to use the body. We're using the body to serve God. We don't say we're not the mind and therefore the mind is an illusion, it doesn't exist, it's not important. No, we are using the mind to serve God. Both the body and the mind are the instruments of the soul. And the more we identify with our soul nature, the more easily we can separate ourselves from the body and the mind and use them as effective instruments to serve God. That's the basic idea. Another thing I want to mention, an important caveat here. Some people here, some people watching online, might just love the classical Advaitic path of knowledge, and that's understandable. There are many reasons why people might be drawn to that path. And another nice thing about Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is that he says, go ahead and practice that. You can do that too. You can practice this classical Advaitic Jnana Yoga, except with two caveats. Number one, don't look upon this world as a dream, because that's not helpful for most people, and it can be very dangerous for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants. And number two, don't put down devotees, and don't think of the personal God as a lower reality. But you can still practice the core of classical Advaita Jnana Yoga, which is what? Meditate on your nature as non-dual pure consciousness. See, in the heart center, you can meditate on yourself as an eternal jivatma, individual soul. That's what Sri Ramakrishna recommends. That's what I call bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga. But you can equally meditate on the Sahasrara Chakra and think of yourself as non-dual pure consciousness. Great, do it. That's fine too, if that's what you like. There's no problem. Because that's true too. It corresponds to truth. Because Sri Ramakrishna fully accepted non-dual pure consciousness, unlike Ramanuja and Madhva and others. But he accepts it. So you can also practice that. Even then, you can combine that practice with all the other yogas, with the bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, with Bhakti Yoga, with Raja Yoga, with Karma Yoga. Okay? And finally, since we don't have much time, I want to just mention a few practical suggestions on how we can incorporate bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, this bhakti kind of Jnana Yoga, path of knowledge, into our daily spiritual practice. Number one, even if you are a simple bhakta, many people call themselves simple bhaktas, that's great. It's a wonderful thing to be a simple bhakta, but that doesn't mean that you can't practice Jnana Yoga at the same time. Try to incorporate a bit of the path of knowledge, bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, into your daily spiritual practice by trying to think of yourself and think of other people. If you've got a family, try to think of your spouse or your partner as a soul rather than the body-mind. Think of your kids, think of your co-workers as souls, using the body and the mind as instruments. The more we think of ourselves as souls, the easier it becomes to think of other people as souls. And even in your meditation, you can spend a few minutes before you go into your whatever practice is recommended by your guru or whatever your main meditation practice is. Just meditate on your true nature as an eternal soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Think of a kind of a light within your heart. Another practical suggestion, never feel guilty about practicing multiple yogas at the same time. There's no need for guilt. There's guilt only when the tradition says that you can't practice X and Y yogas at the same time. But that's not a problem from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. You can and should try to combine all four yogas. Why? Because each of the four yogas cultivates a different aspect of the human personality. Karma Yoga cultivates the dynamic, volitional side of our nature. Jnana Yoga, the intellectual side. Bhakti Yoga, the devotional, emotional side. Raja Yoga, the faculty of concentration and meditation. So won't we make the most spiritual progress if we combine our resources and maximize the energy within the human system? Of course. So we can do that, and we should do that. We should try to combine the four yogas to the best of our ability. Another subtler point, this is a whole nother lecture. If you're interested, watch a lecture of mine called The Three Gunas in Spiritual Life, a Practical Guide. Try to become as sattvic as possible in your day-to-day life. And as I said, that's going to take another hour just to explain. Because in every walk of life, there's a sattvic way of behaving, there's a rajasic way of behaving, there's a tamasic way of behaving. What kind of music do you listen to? Is it rajasic, sattvic, tamasic? What kind of movies do you watch? What's your relationship with your spouse like, your partner like? What's your relationship with your kids like? What's your relationship with your coworkers like? Literally everything can be classified according to what kind of food do you eat. You'll find these kinds of classifications in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and many other texts, okay? But why do I say that it's helpful to try to become as sattvic as possible? I'll mention one thing very quickly. 18.37 of Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavan Krishna talks about sattvika happiness, sattvika joy. And he uses a very evocative Sanskrit phrase. He says that sattvika forms of joy are grounded in Atma Buddhi Prasada. Atma Buddhi Prasada, which means it's born of the satisfaction of the higher intellect, the Buddhi, and the Atma. And here I would suggest that Atma is the Jivatma, the individual soul. So sattvika joys, whether that's the joy of spiritual practice, whether it's the joy of listening to spiritual music, whether it's interacting in a sattvic way with other people, sattvika joys gratify the deeper soul within. Whereas rajasika pleasures, all sense pleasures, all forms of instant gratification, worldly fulfillments, they gratify the body-mind complex. So anything, the more rajasic and tamasic we are, the more we get entrenched in our body consciousness, the more we identify with the body-mind complex. The more sattvic we become, the more we try to populate our lives with sattvika forms of activity and behavior, the more we gradually erode our identification with the body-mind complex, the more we naturally identify with the deeper soul within. So that's why we should try to be more and more sattvic. And another tip, which I find very practical, is listen to devotional spiritual music in whatever tradition that you like, or all traditions. You know, I like listening to Indian music, classical music, and bhajans, and also sacred classical music from the West, and whatever you like, because it's a wonderful way to become more sattvic, and to, you know, especially devotional music. Every devotional song has a certain bhava. Bhava is a term which means a kind of spiritual attitude. And in devotional music, usually it's an attitude of surrender, of prayer, where the singer or the one composing the song feels that they're a child of God. And so by listening to music with concentration, we kind of naturally, it doesn't feel artificial anymore. We can just naturally identify with the consciousness of the composer and feel ourselves to be children of the divine, okay? And another tip which Raja Maharaj, Brahmanandaji, used to recommend, he would say, when you find the mind sinking downward, repeat a verse from the Gita or some other good scripture. Because even repeating a Sanskrit verse, Sanskrit itself is a very powerful spiritual language. And that's another reason why I encourage memorizing at least a few handy scriptural verses, some of your favorite scriptural verses. Because then even if you don't have the text handy, it can come from within. And in moments when you really need it, you can bring up those verses. Okay, so do we have time for a brief meditation, or should we just skip it? It's 12:03. That's up to you.
How long?
5 minutes?
And then we can have Q&A afterwards.
Okay.
In the garden.
Okay. Or we can give them the choice, whatever's.
Do you guys prefer meditation or Q&A?
Okay, they all want meditation. All right. Gently close your eyes. Visualize a light in your heart center. And please repeat after me. I am the radiant light within. I am perfect, eternal, luminous, and without blemish. I am not the body. The body is my instrument. I am not the mind. The mind is my instrument.
Mind is my instrument.
I am a spark of the divine fire.
I am the spark of the divine fire.
I am the radiant light within.
I am the radiant light within.
Now please, as you continue to meditate on this effulgent light in your heart center, please chant with me Om. We'll be doing some long Oms, a few Oms. Now continue to repeat Om, but do this please mentally as you continue to meditate on that effulgent light within. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
So why don't we just go ahead, just take 5 minutes, let's finish off the session with a few questions we do have here. Just wait for the microphone to come to you, Darcy. Just raise your hand if you have a question. Left everybody speechless.
Yeah, sorry. That's what happens when you end on meditation. People are in a different state of mind. They don't want to argue.
So with the Vedanta, you didn't talk about inquiry.
Well, that is inquiry. Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana. The Manana especially would be inquiry, right?
But you spoke of it more as just...
Intellectual reflection.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess so. Self-inquiry and the way that Ramana Maharshi puts it. Yeah, I would say that falls under Manana and Nididhyasana. That's the way I'd put it. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, what exactly is the self? Who am I? Right? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very well spoken. So these states of consciousness, that sounds like a hierarchy, and it might be yogas that are more conducive to reaching lower versus the higher levels. So it's not clear that you may progress through the yogas, and given that there are so many worldly people around us, they don't have the time as the monks do to practice all these different yogas.
I think they have more time to practice all the yogas in a way. Raising your kids is karma yoga. You know, going to work, karma yoga.
Right.
And yeah, so I would disagree on that, but go ahead, yeah.
Well, anyway, so there are states, it sounds like the states of consciousness, which is a hierarchy. So some are higher.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. So what your suggestion is, you kind of get the feeling from the way that you heard Sri Ramakrishna explaining the different states of consciousness, going from bottom up to the, crown of the head, that there seems to be an implicit hierarchy, at least there. I think it's true to a certain extent, but not in a kind of, in a problematic way. The three lower centers are actually lower, and all of spiritual life is about getting consciousness out of those three lower centers, which is consciousness immersed in worldliness, right? Up to the heart center, and then, but starting with the heart center, what Sri Ramakrishna will say is that all of these are true states of consciousness, and that they're non-hierarchically related with each other. That's the whole point of his, what I quoted to you earlier in this talk, which is he has come to the final realization that sometimes he thinks of himself as a servant of God, sometimes as a portion of God, sometimes as the whole of God in the sense of identity, as non-dual pure consciousness, which means that he's not saying that there's a hierarchy where one is truer than the other. He's saying that they're all true. And that the Vijnani, he says, he likens it to a flautist who has a flute with 7 holes. And he says, why should I only play like put my finger on one hole and go, that's boring. He likens that to just saying, Soham, I am that Brahman. I want to play ragas and raginis on that flute. So I want to relate to and commune with the divine in many different ways. And he can do that and enjoy that because they're all true. There's no hierarchy there. Okay?
Yeah, one other question. In this skeptical bodily consciousness age, as you so well described, I find the easiest method, other than the ones you mentioned, in particular bhakti, to be japa yoga.
Japa. That falls under bhakti, right? I mean, that's how.
Well, I don't think of it as bhakti. I just follow the sound of the mantra to the source of the mind, which is pure consciousness.
Oh, I see. So you're using it more in an Advaitic way.
And then it cleanses and moves me down the path. To me, that's especially easy. I don't have to get into dualistic considerations or practices, which to me keep me divided and take too long.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Else.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you don't find that in Shankara's commentaries. It's not something that he recommends, but I think you can probably make a case that you can find it in later post-Shankara Advaitic texts like Panchadashi. They encourage meditation on Nirguna Brahman and japa of Om while thinking of non-dual pure consciousness. So that in a sense is it's a way of getting around this difficulty of eligibility requirements for Jnana Yoga, because it's a kind of in-between practice, which has an element of Bhakti Yoga because of the japa side, but then at the same time, it's oriented toward not the personal God, but non-dual pure consciousness. So that's an interesting.
I think about the meaning of the mantra.
I get it. Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. Yeah.
To the source. That's all I do.
Yeah.
Effortlessly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's nice.
I go to sleep. Effortless.
Yeah. That's nice. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Ideally, questions. Yeah. Especially questions related to the talk. Hi.
When you talked about Ramakrishna's idea of the jiva, he made it sound like it's the relationship, the bhava, with whatever relationship we have, with the divine. How would that be put into practice as far as a meditation, or as far as Jnana Yoga goes?
Yeah. So that soul in our heart center. See, this is something that I talk about in other talks. I just didn't have the time here. Shravan will say, in spiritual life, we have to cultivate a certain attitude toward God. And he usually uses the Vaishnava scheme. And so he says it can be thinking of yourself as a parent and looking on Krishna or God as your child. Think of God as your friend. You can think of God as your parent, like a mother or father. Think of God as your lover, that's Madhura Bhava, and so on. And then, interestingly, his own bhava is not included in his main bhava, which is Shantan Bhava, the attitude of a child toward God, right? He says, I am a child of Divine Mother. He says, Shantan Bhav Ati Shuddho Bhav. The purest of all attitudes is the attitude of a child toward his mother. And so Sri Ramakrishna will say, we need to stabilize ourselves in a particular attitude toward God, in a particular bhava. And so when we practice this bhakti-oriented Jnana Yoga, and when we meditate on that Jivatma, we can make that Jivatma our own once we identify what our bhava is. And first of all, that itself is like not the easiest thing. I think one of the best helps in identifying what our fundamental bhava is listening to music, because then different kinds of songs have different bhavas, as I said. And so depending on what kind of music most resonates with you, most moves you, you can kind of like, I'm a child of God. That's what I was all along, and I am all along without knowing it. And then what you can do is you can fill in that Jnana Yoga practice as you meditate on that effulgent light within, the Jivatma, that spark. You think of that spark as a child of God. Sri Aurobindo actually says, he calls the soul a psychic being, and he says that psychic being is nothing but the child of God. Right, but that's if you want that, if that's your natural attitude. But if your natural attitude is one of, a different kind of relationship, whether it's friend or whatever, you think of the soul as a friend of God. You see? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
To think of myself as a child of God, I tend to think more of mother than of myself.
Okay, but that's what a child does. Thinks of mother a lot, right? I mean, there are different kinds of children, but some children are obsessed with the mother, and
So
yeah.
is that a
That's also
jhana practice in that sense?
Yeah, but remember, see, the key here is identifying with the eternal soul separate from the body-mind complex. If that's what you're doing, that's Jnana Yoga, right? Yeah. Other questions?
So we can then continue the
Great.
Q&A outside.
Thank you, everyone. Should I chant closing mantra or
No, we'll have,
no?
I'll have you and that will do.
Okay.
Just do. I have to finish by a certain time. We'll do announcements right now. Okay. First, thank you, Swami Medhananda, for this beautiful talk. It was just, he gave a whole synopsis there, and I, Swami, as you're talking, you're reminding me of conversations I had with one specific Swami in Bellarmine. And I remember he said when he interpreted that, what is Bhakti Yoga? Why does Ramakrishna say what Bhakti Yoga? Bhakti Yoga is the yoga for this yuga. And he said, Bhakti Yoga, he interpreted as Bhakti Marga. So what does he mean by Bhakti Marga? Bhakti Marga means basically that your attitude towards the divine is that of a personal relationship, separate from like what we call Jnana Marga, where your attitude is more of an impersonal relationship. And within Bhakti Marga, you have all four yogas. So it's different from yoga. Bhakti Yoga we think is as the path of love. But within Bhakti Marga, your attitude being that what you think of the divine in a personal way, you have all four yogas there. Karma, Raja, all the four yogas. Okay, I don't want to get into that. But what Swamiji was saying then is maybe in the sense that I synthesize, because we're identified with the first three chakras, the lower chakras, which is our body, mind, we're really associated with our body. Maybe Ramakrishna is saying then that the best thing to do is have, at this point, have a relationship with the divine in a personal sense. In the impersonal sense, maybe it's too difficult at this because we're still absorbed in our body consciousness. Then Swami say, once you can identify with that fourth chakra, where everything opens up, where you're no longer identified with the body mind, you identify with your own personal individual spirit called the Pratyekatman, Jivatman, or the Avanaloka? How do you do?
Atma Avalokana.
Atma Avanaloka. There's different ways of interpreting, but you are now the light. You're this individual light. You're no longer body. You're not meat sees meat. You go to a gym, people working out, they see only bodies. Go to a university, full of minds, say, I love that person. I love their ideas. You're in love with someone's ideas, mind. At this point, they say, when you see yourself as the individual light, not the supreme light, the individual light, now you understand, getting a glimpse of what is God. God is the supreme light. At this point, they say everything in Swami, we call it Gona Bhakti, beginning Bhakti. All he said this, when you're doing your japa meditation, all this is just to get you out of that. wants to get you to know who you are. Once you understand you're this individual light, you are the same light as the supreme light. Now you know what the divine is and no longer identified. Now you want to go to the supreme, para-bhakti. There's this bhakti now. I enough of the world now. I want to experience who you are, because I know I'm just a reflection of you. I'm just, as you're saying, the spark,
of divine fire.
right? And now knowing that I'm not attracted anymore. I'm not seeing body. I don't even care about your ideas. I just want to know the supreme light, the God in all its effulgence. So from that point on, you now go to that divine, and then either you dissolve yourself in that Advaitic approach, or you just dissolve your individual self into the supreme self, and that's, if you want to call it Advaita, or you want to be in proximity. You want to be in the proximity of that. So depending on, and as I think what Swamiji was saying when you asked your question was it when you said hierarchy, right?
Well, he was saying
Yeah,
I'm saying
hierarchy.
It's not.
But it's a hierarchy, not nonsense, but it's a hierarchy in the sense that there's no hierarchy in your attitudes.
Yeah.
In your attitude, think of it as your attitude. What attitude do you have to the divine? There's no hierarchy to that. Ultimately, he's saying it's the same. It's mukti, is the same thing as mukti. I mean, you're going to get liberated.
Becoming sugar or eating sugar, that is.
Yeah, exactly, right. So anyways, he synthesized a lot of ideas. I mean, it's a brilliant talk, because there's a lot there, and you have to be familiar with just the different Madhva Dvaita, Vishisha Dvaita, but it was really put together in the sense of what Ramakrishna was talking about. So thank you, Swamiji,
Thanks so much.
for that. And a couple announcements. One is that, one I want to do make announcements. Part of the Vedanta, San Diego Vedanta, we have the Vedanta Life Academy. In the Vedanta Life Academy, what's happening right now is we have a course on sacred pilgrimages. How many have seen any of the courses so far? Just a few. Okay, great. So what's happening right now is we are going to different sacred spaces and learning about those spaces as embodied sacred spaces. So we just went to Dakshineshwar. How many went to Dakshineshwar with us last time? You weren't there, Dr. Barra, right? In Dakshineshwar. We went to Dakshineshwar, and guess who came? Do you remember who made an appearance? Anybody? Who made a live appearance there? The Divine Mother Kali. Live, we had a live darshan of Mother Kali on there. And the idea was really taking you into that space, seeing what Dakshineshwar is about, and going to spaces where Ramakrishna, I mean, he just brought you in there. And in every aspect, you're like, the gospel became living. You were brought into the scene back in the 1860s, 1870s, as Ramakrishna was walking back and forth. You felt like you were there. The next space we're going into is Puri. So when you go to these different sacred spaces, you can discover that when you see these temples, the architecture is symbolic of the divine itself. Do you know that when you go to an Indian temple, it's actually designed in what is called the 5 koshas? There's like 5 different barriers till you get to the inner sanctum, which is the divine itself. So there's like the body kosha, the body, the prana kosha. There's 5 different barriers, and even in the temples, sometimes you'll see they're led up and down. It said that temples are 7 sacred spaces going up, 7 sacred spaces going down, symbolic of the 7 different type of heavens and 7 types of hells. And then they have these gopuras, those little things that represent the absolute, the Brahman, on the very top of the temples. So you'll get an embodied. So next week we're taking you to Puri, and to understand what spirituality is embodied in the architecture, embodied in the sacred space, embodied in the deity. So if you'd like to go, it's free for everyone. It's just go to VedantaLifeAcademy.com and sign up there.